Let's get it started.
Double O.
Think like a rapper.
This is your boy Double O, and we are back, episode 112 of your favorite podcast, Think Like a Rapper. I hope you are doing well this week. I hope that you are treating yourself well, and hopefully you made something awesome for yourself. I've been in this very interesting sort of space where I'm realizing the Europeans had it right the whole time, at least partially right the whole time. I think that this time being paused has forced us to analyze the mechanics of the American dream. This go, 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 progress at all costs attitude, I think, has not benefited us in everyday life, in our relationships, in our pursuit of true happiness. And so I hope that you are taking some time, as I am, with this stillness, to really embrace the slowdown, embrace the awesome things that boredom, a mundane day can do. Learn how to make a new cool drink, learn how to make some cool meals, read a book the real way, not on Audible, just cracking one open and reading it and turning pages. But as we slowly move forward out of this, I wonder what this slowdown will reveal about the parts of American culture that we no longer want to hold true, the stories that we realize are no longer relevant to today's society. One of my close friends runs the Monarch Agency. His name is Curtis House. And he's always been on the ground, really identifying true trends and understanding the difference between what is sold to us as an idea in a product and what is actually valid and important to us. So I wanted to explore that, see how he was doing, and figure out what happens with this Mr. Me Too hypebeast economy when it's all said and done. Think like a rapper.
So far, so good. You know.
Yeah, let's jump right in. What? Thank you for making time to be on Think Like a Rapper. What? You were just talking about your sort of daily regimen, and I know that I actually don't know how long you've been, but I know that you've obviously been running for a good part of your life. What have you in terms of your routine increased or decreased as all this craziness has kind of started?
Running has been pretty consistent for me over the last few years. I mean, I was an athlete in high school. I played ball, ran cross country as a requirement to play ball. And so,
Damn, what kind of, wait, hold on. What school did you have where you had to run cross country to play ball?
My coach, my high school basketball coach, James Alfred, shout out to Coach. He was just one of those sort of like great coaches where he was just focused on heart and like focused on work ethic, And so in the summer, we had to run. It was just what it was. We had to run cross country and we had to run all summer long. Is what he was about. So that's what we did. But I wasn't some sort of stellar ball player or anything like that. I was just mainly like a great defender and had a lot of heart and whatnot. But to get back to your original question, I mean, running has been I think a really consistent things to get involved in. My athletic passion has always really revolved around martial arts, and with everything being shut down, the sort of only real athletic opportunity that allows itself to kind of not to be interrupted is running. I think in the last couple of years you've also seen sort of running take shape and form amongst a lot of athletes and a lot of just regular individuals who may not necessarily consider themselves athletes because of its accessibility. For me, it's just something that I enjoy as a sort of a daily thing to get into like a meditative state. It gives me that sort of break from the routine, break from the regimen, break from the workload, the stress, whatever. And it's just and I think there's something really pure about that and something very freeing about that. And also, very challenging as well, like being sort of just locked into your own individual challenges, whether they be, distance or maybe some injuries or maybe just, trying to work through whatever you have going on in your head. It's, for me, very therapeutic. So as this has evolved, there hasn't really been much of a change. I run like every other day. Basically I alternate between like running and then doing like calisthenics and like weight training. And I think the only thing that may have changed is just sort of the consistency, right? So like there's a greater requirement for discipline around doing that on a daily basis because of the conditions that we're in.
It's interesting because as you were talking, it also felt like you were maybe subliminally saying also that that in taking up running and then taking up this very individual endeavor and this thing where you're essentially, for the duration that your body can make it, trapped inside your mind, kind of trying to battle it to get to the finish line, that that has been beneficial to an extent for this sort of situation that we're in, because I think for a lot of people, this is the first time that they've been forced to sit with their own thoughts in a way that they may not, everyone is always able to find kind of their own excuse to not sit with it, to not really be there. But now it's, as I talk to more and more people, everything is being kind of analyzed and overanalyzed. And do you think that running has been helpful in that, maybe even for you?
To a degree. For those that may not know, like I work from home, so this in many ways is almost kind of normal for me. Like I'm typically alone unless I'm traveling or, engaging a client or doing something.
But you
social.
do travel a lot.
I do. And, there's sort of an ebb and flow with that, right? And this, ironically enough, falls kind of within, the ebb of that. Like this period of time is usually when things are a bit slower before my travel schedule kind of picks up. But I say that to say that, like, I am pretty present most of the time. Like, okay. I do a lot of sort of just, daily self-analyzation and thinking and whatnot. But I think, to your point, for many, this has been probably a very confronting time, right? There is this moment where everything is sort of grounded to a halt, and everyone has this time in this isolation to really sort of give thought and reflection to, themselves and sort of the greater purpose that they're living towards and living for, and also sort of where we headed societally and collectively. And I think it's needed, with social media and, the sort of continued acceleration of technology. We've really entered this space now where there are fewer and fewer moments where I think people have this time where there aren't any distractions to really sort of pull them away from whatever, they may be needing to think about or avoiding thinking about, or maybe just haven't really had that breath of fresh air to really even dive into reflecting on those things. And so it's interesting, I think, for many to sort of have the opportunity to do, what many also sort of refer to as like that self-work, of sort of like diving in and starting to look at yourself with that considered perspective.
Are there things that you've learned over the years of doing it through all the different practices that you think might be helpful to people that are just starting it sort of now? And maybe, to a certain extent, it can be a bit overwhelming. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of people on Twitter, there's a lot of like, if you're not depressed during this time, then you're a sociopath. If you're not whatever. And I laugh at it, but then I'm also just like, I'm not going through those sort of emotional swings because, like you, I've spent a good majority of my adult life working from home or working remotely. And the joys of being an artist is that you're having a midlife crisis every 6 months. And so you're always analyzing whether you're full of shit or not, because whatever you believe and perceive yourself to be, you have to now present to the world and own whatever it is, and through every album, through every project, through everything you put out publicly, that is one of those things that you're always confronting. And so for you, yeah, do you, as you've been going through your sort of journey with it and always improving and always figuring stuff out, are there things that for people at step one, do you have any recommendations from step 4 or 5?
I think the first thing is just really sort of finding a space to be at peace with the situation, right? So I think a lot of people's anxieties, and I've gone through this as well. I have my weeks where I'm cool and my weeks where I'm like, yo, I'm stir crazy, right? I think it's just understanding that collectively, right, globally, we are as a society facing something that is unique, right? So no one's ever been through this before, the way that we're going through it, and because of that, no one really has the answers. And I think that a lot of times we as human beings sort of, are programmed and trained to think individually about how can I solve whatever problem I'm facing? How can I relieve whatever discomfort is currently bothering me? And those are rational, logical things, right? But ultimately, I think there's a sort of, a wisdom that you have to employ, which is understanding that this is a sort of thing that's far bigger than any one individual, and that the outcome of this is largely TBD. So the first thing is just making peace with that, right? Just understanding that, look, you don't have to have the answer, right?
Because there is no answer.
Yeah, there is no answer, right? And then the second thing is just understanding as well is we, especially in America, right, we're such a productivity focused culture because of being, capitalist. And we're used to having these milestones, whether they be hourly milestones or task milestones, or the expectations of our higher ups or client base or whomever, that typically sort of set the cadence to our daily actions, right? So it's like you've got meetings up to this point, you've got deadlines at this point, etc. In the absence of that, there's this sort of vacuum, right? This like task vacuum, and that structure being eroded. I think a lot of people find themselves sort of without a sense of being, like, well, what am I supposed to be doing with myself, which is also valid, right? So I think the second thing is like give yourself some sort of a structure, take the opportunity to say, hey, look, like, all right, well, maybe my day is empty, maybe my day is open, or maybe half the day is open. What are my priorities? What are the things that I think I want to do with my time? What are the things that I feel like doing with my time? And kind of embrace this unpleasantness, right, for the opportunity that I think it offers. I think that's the other thing. And thirdly, I think it's just allow yourself to be uncomfortable, right? Like that's the other thing. I think just there's certain times where no matter what you do, right? If you go for a long run, if you have a vigorous workout, if you talk to friends, sometimes you're just going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay as well. Understanding sort of what's making you uncomfortable, thinking through, those things, and just being at peace with, the fact that the answer may not come immediately, that it may take a couple days or a week, but eventually it will come. I think those are the 3 most important things that I would suggest to anyone.
Yeah, no. I think, and to add on to the first piece was, it also would be like, be extremely easy with yourself. I think that that oftentimes in a lot of these periods where we're really digging in, there can often be a lot of like, oh, I haven't gotten to the point, I haven't gotten to the thing I should be doing, I'm not doing enough, or I'm sleeping on I fell asleep today at 2:00 and woke up at 3, and I should be doing all this during all this time because I have so much time. And I think you're right. At the end of the day, this has been a larger sort of, even for me personally, but to talk in America in general, I feel like this has been a very large test of the system and a very specific test of the story of America, right? This go, 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 progress at all costs. If it doesn't get you 3 or 4 or 5 steps or 10 steps ahead, then it's not worth it. And it's, this very sort of goal-focused, goal-oriented sort of way, which in a lot of ways has been beneficial to us in terms of innovation. But I think also on a personal level sometimes has set us on these tracks that very easily burns everything around us to the ground in order to maintain this idea of progress. You know, like what I've found myself doing is being okay with just like doing some things slowly, right? Like for me, for instance, everything about the regular day routine, whether it be walking a dog, cooking, all that stuff, was always attached to, I need to do that thing as quickly and as whatever is the quickest ways possible, stick this food in my mouth, get back to making beats, get back to editing video, get back to, you know, thinking about the next 6 to 12 months for what Kids in the Hall needs to be, yada, 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 right? But now, because there are no time constraints on those things, on some projects there are, but there are no time constraints really, it's allowed me to actually be happy and enjoy, like, oh, I'm going to make this meal good for me. I'm going to enjoy that process. Like, instead of just downing an entire bottle of red wine, maybe I'll sit and figure out how to make old fashions and figure out like the craftsmanship of those things, and in that way enjoy it, those small things that now can be dragged out much longer, a whole lot more than just go, 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 because somehow the thing you actually want is at the end, when it might actually just be these sort of simple things. You know, I'm interested, you know, you being from the Midwest and now living on the West Coast, how your feelings even about city life are in this time, because you are in the one of the more cityfied areas of LA, you know, being downtown, and when walkability can't help you because there's nowhere to walk to. You know, have you been re-examining sort of like, where do I want to live in the next 5 years? What does the next 10 years in terms of my residence, or, you know, how I want to see kind of my life in that sort of way? Has that changed at all? Have you thought about that at all? Or is it still?
It's tough to say, right? I think there's a few things, right? Like, I live where I live now largely because of the stage of life that I'm in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, unmarried, no children, you know, working in a business which is, you know, focused on culture, and, you know, coming from a city that is, you know, urban and vertical, right? Wanting the same sort of environmental stimuli that I've had in other places, and at the same time wanting proximity to people similar to myself who are creative and are doing things to push culture forward. Looking at sort of the impact of this epidemic on perceptions of value around the places that we choose to live, you know, I think there's a couple things that I want to point out. The first is, you know, you were touching on sort of this, the ability to sort of slow down, right, and like savor things. As someone who travels frequently, I know that you also probably are very much aware of sort of the lifestyle differences that you encounter when you go to Europe, for instance. The
Sure.
pace in which life is enjoyed and life is engaged at, right? Whether it's like the siesta culture of Spain, or just sort of like the laissez-faire-ness of like France, right? Where it's just like, hey, you know, it's not a big deal, right? Like, we as Americans often complain about, you know, lack of service because things take all day, or, you know, we're always in the rush, and we're criticized for that. And I think that there's a gaping reality that's coming to form now because, again, you know, we mentioned earlier, for the first time we have a moment to kind of slow down, right? The speed at which we're moving, I think, has masked the unsustainability of our culture, right? Like, we've been moving at such a light speed that we've never really stopped and taken a moment to really assess, like, is this healthy and is this sustainable? Are we balanced or not? And I think it's becoming more and more clear to many, some who haven't, you know, maybe had the opportunity or the time to have the revelation that, yeah, we're not. We're living in a very unbalanced way, or have been, right? And I think for all of, you know, modern capitalism's advantages and the ability to, you know, so-called move communities and societies out of, you know, third world conditions and poverties or whatnot, there's also the other side of it, which we know is not as healthy, which is not as beneficial, right? So for me, as, you know, someone who's in his late 30s, my worldview and sort of priorities around, the sort of environment that I want to live in are largely based upon my, experiences about, in my life, but also ideas about where do I want to go.
Yeah.
Right. But I think and in my perspective, as much I would say is broader than someone who's younger than me, because I've just had more time to live and experience things. Right. So I think, for me, no, there isn't really the bigger impact on my perception in regards to where I want to be and what I need and what I value. I mean, for me, there's always kind of been a plan, and that plan is, at a point in time, there will be a distance.
Okay.
Right.
There's an
And
escape out of the city.
yeah, I mean, there'll be a distance, right? There'll be a distance that I will engage, let's just say, like urban society at, right? And there'll be a place in which I kind of, take refuge in and spend probably the bulk of my time. But I think that's also largely because of, as you start to age, right? Those are things that you naturally assess, right? I would be more interested in sort of wondering for, people that are in their 20s, who've been really kind of their whole life enveloped by the modern sort of social media, always on society. If I would want to ask and, have the conversations around how have their perceptions on, where they want to live and the valuation of, living in an urban environment changed. And we can dive into that a bit if you'd like.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because I know that's what you focus on, asking those questions for people and getting those sort of answers, especially from, focus groups and in other ways. So I am also interested, I'd definitely love to talk about kind of whether it be speculation or whether it be, having had some anecdotal conversations, the answer to the question you just asked, and then also maybe how it's affecting I think what is a larger question. So I think one of the other sort of like curtain pullbacks on the marketing of culture industry, right, has always been that there is this sort of like a gentrified consumer that is marketed towards that there is some that the product or whatever it is some sort of authentic idea of the culture. But then oftentimes when you talk to the people you assume most closely related to the culture, right, that are in urban areas, that are in the hood, they have no clue about those things, or they value very, very different things. And I do wonder if we're going to come out of this and there's going to be this weird, those things can't go back together as easily anymore in terms of selling it, because the value propositions will be vastly, vastly different.
Yeah, I think it really depends on how long this goes on, right? So, the longer that we're at a place where people are inconvenienced and ultimately some people are suffering, the more of a reality check this will be in terms of the validity of our societal systems and our marketing and our sales and all those sort of things, right? So for the last, 8 years or so, we've been in this sort of feeding frenzy, right, of like economics and commerce, and especially within specific spaces as they relate to lifestyle products, right? Things that really just aren't essential, whether it be like athletic apparel, streetwear, sneaker culture, right? Like all of these things have really taken off and have really been embraced by, millennial generations, things that have been fueled by social media. It's kind of been like, the perfect storm of this engine of demand met with like the engine of like the global supply chain and like fast fashion. And so, you have this consumer model that's both, it's kind of like, in many ways, like a drug dealer getting high on their own supply, right? Because it's like on one hand you've got kids that are like, yo, we want new dope sneakers, and then on the other hand you've got like all your big box companies like pushing them out every week. There's half a dozen new releases, right? And then you've got the resale channel sort of like overhyping which ones are going to be valued at a certain dollar amount. You've got the kids lining up and sleeping overnight to get those shoes, right? And, it's an unsustainable thing on part because on one hand, there's too many releases to meet the available, like these shoes now don't really attain any real incentive financially to balance out the investment of time by the kids that stood in line, right? And on the other hand, there's also just sort of the overarching reality that's like, yo, it's just a shoe. You know what I mean? Like outside, like what's its real value to your life outside of, social cachet and maybe some sense of, self-worth that's falsely instilled because it's based upon something material that doesn't really matter, right? So again, I think if this prolongs, then that reality becomes, something that will become hard hitting because, those kids, those collectors, those businesses, those companies who are part of this life cycle will start to have to, make those adjustments and come to those realizations. If it is something that goes on for another couple months, which in some way, form, or shape it will,
definitely could.
You would then have a valuation of sort of what does matter, right? And for millennials in particular, I think it's a really important time for them because they've been raised largely in an environment that was very sort of unskilled, right? Like they're incredibly adept at social media. They're incredibly adept at communicating and producing, content. But, do you know how to cook food, right? Like, do you know how to, do anything that's sort of like trade based?
Can you use a hammer and a nail? Do you
hammer and nail? Do you hang stuff? Do you know how tools work, right? Like, and that's a larger conversation, right? Like we grew up in an era where there were like trade schools, right, that you go to in like high school and learn all sorts of things. Like there was home ec, right, and all of those things were kind of pushed to the wayside. But we, I think, are at a point now where this crisis is really starting to make people have to reanalyze, what really has worth and really has value. Now, from a brand standpoint, I think, your point earlier about sort of this sort of gentrified model of marketing, right, of this gentrified consumer, we're still facing some of the same challenges, right, internally, right? So for the last 10 years or so, maybe 15, as more and more multiculturals have entered the marketing and brand side of things, there's been a larger conversation sort of around the lack of diversity and lack of inclusivity amongst these major companies that are making these decisions, right? And by decisions, it's not just about sort of, we're going to put out this product or we're going to sign this athlete, but it's also about sort of the culture that's being created by them, right? Because with all of their reach and all of their doors and all of their marketing dollars, there's a narrative that each of these brands kind of injects into society. And that either resonates with consumers or influences them or turns them off, depending on sort of where you fall in line with that brand messaging, right? And we still see that challenge today. Like when I walk into, the offices of major corporate brands or meet with these global teams that lead sort of, future planning 3, 4, 5 years in the future about where we're going to be at or what products we want to launch or sort of trying to understand where consumers are coming from, there's very little representation. So I think representation is still like a huge, huge challenge, right? Moving into this sort of, well, how does that affect, or get affected by the phase that we're in now? I think, it's still going to be a bit of a difficulty, right? Because I think at the core of it, there's still a lack of real on the ground engagement from brands, right? Like there's still a lot of, assumptions that are being made by the people that are in the building based upon their experiences. And their background just may not be, accurate. It may not be, one that resonates with where things are currently. Doesn't mean they're bad people. Doesn't mean that they don't have good intentions. It's just simply that, the system as it's established, I don't think is built to really allow a lot of outside input. And that's true around a lot of different companies. Where we go from here, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it always takes what I've realized with working with brands, other major corporations, variety. It takes just somebody, doesn't matter who or what they are, but they just have to be in the know enough to either hire the people that properly represent the what they're trying to do, or know how to get to those sort of to that answer, because it's interesting because I'm always battling with this. I don't know if you ever watched that the Russ interview with Joe Budden, when he was talking about this weird cycle that's happening where specifically related to hip hop and new hip hop is spending so much time listening to the fan because the fan is right there and wanting a certain kind of music, that we're in this weird space where Black creators are being driven by 13-year-old white kids in places that don't understand, kind of what's going on. And this weird sort of cycle is happening of feeding a certain kind of music back into the larger story that maybe just, that isn't really resonating, but it's the quick hit that those kids actually want. And learning, I was talking to someone yesterday and I was saying, I hope that creators and all creators, including creators of corporations, take this time to sort of understand that the process isn't always just a quick hit and go sort of thing. That really savoring even the process of building out these ideas and writing these stories that are eventually going to become marketing campaigns, that are eventually going to become products. To take the time to really make those things matter a little bit more. Because I think oftentimes we all have fallen in love, when we think about Nike, that story was not a, 6-month story, the story of, are you muted? Talk real quick. I am. Okay, yeah, you were saying right, but nothing was happening. Sorry. Yeah, these are all long, slow built, oftentimes deliberate, but sometimes, just happenstance because it was so connected to the culture that it was trying to project into the world, that it allowed those things to really grow and mature, so that when it really scales, it's like, oh yeah, this is anything and everything, and I could buy into this entire world. And what we have now is this rush to create that titan over and over again. And that, that comes in the music side, it comes in everybody trying to be who's the fastest person that can get behind, that can get to Jay-Z and $1 billion or whatever. And on the brand side, it's like, oh, who's going to be the next Air Jordan? Who's going to be the next Nike? Not realizing that these stories took decades. This is not, these are not going to be quick sort of things. And so sometimes in the rush to create product that will scale you that fast, you're going to create shitty product or at least product that doesn't mean anything in a very short amount of time,
to touch on that,
a little rambling.
Success, can be a dangerous thing, right? Like when brands try something or artists try something or labels try something and it works one time, right? And they see that sort of, that profit spike, that demand spike, people want to sort of duplicate the model, right? Like you saw it with spirit companies starting in like 2010, with the influencer marketing programs, right? How the initial program with Belvedere was incredibly successful. And then from there, LVMH adopted it to Hennessy and pushed it through Hennessy. And then, that sparked sort of the brown spirit crave, right? But also opened up this space where, Grey Goose jumps into, the influencer space. And then Ciroc comes on board and jumps into it. And then it becomes sort of a standard marketing, tool that every other sort of business model tries to employ, right? And there's a dilution between, the start and the initial program and like sort of where things end up societally is the accepted way, right? Yeah. To your point, it's the long, involved, detailed, grassroots, resonating narrative that has, truth and relevance to the consumer, versus sort of the quick fix, quick hit, tactic that just is sort of, pretty shallow, right? And so, even now when we talk about sort of, the space that we're in now and being able to sort of slow down and be a little more considered, or hoping at least that brands do that. I don't know if we're going to see that, right? Because I think that it really has to come from the consumer, right? I think brands are going to do what they just know how to do, right? Like at the end of the day, unfortunately, like the way that they're set up is that, there's shareholders, and shareholders care about one thing, which is like the bottom line. They're not invested in culture. They don't come from ultimately like the places that we come from. They're not on the ground, and, they're just looking to see if they're getting the return they expected. And, these leadership teams at these companies answer to them, and they're forcing themselves to try to make decisions that they feel like will make up a certain, bottom line. And I think if you approach anything like that, you're ultimately going to make some sacrifices, right? And that just, I think, is the way that capitalism is. It isn't sort of this considered way of doing things, especially here in America, right? So,
yeah, I do think though that where we're at though is we are re-examining that, and I do, pick to bounce to another question. Do you think that the consumer will demand something differently after this because of financial constraints, right? Everyone coming out of this is not going to be out here just all of a sudden flush with cash. B, the value proposition of a lot of things will have changed, and then maybe see people the story has changed. Like societally, I feel like there's a paradigm shift, or there's a rewrite that is happening. What do you think, just as all speculation at this point, what do you think doesn't make it through the next sort of iteration? Like if this was a BC AD sort of moment, what sort of things do you think may not make it the next 18 months? If we do come back, pretty soon, at least in our space, like culturally, these sort of products that are always being sold.
Well, I think it's a key moment in time, right? Like it's definitely a BC AC thing, right? There's going to be sort of this historical analysis of change in culture, right? Before Corona and after Corona, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's the key thing that I think a lot of people are missing is that this is a global thing, right? Like this is like people, yeah, it's globally, the disease is everywhere. Yes. But, when I talk to my friends in, Beirut, or I talk to my friends in Jakarta, or I talk to my friends in New York or Amsterdam or London or Paris or wherever, right? Like everyone is going through the same exact challenges, right? Like some people's work is being affected in terms of they've lost their job. Other people's work is being affected as like they're working from home. There's lots of layoffs. People have the same sort of challenges to access to goods. They can't find certain foods. They're having the same challenges in terms of going stir crazy, right? So in many ways, it could possibly be the first really truly like globally unifying event, right? Because the last time there was something on this scale that affected everyone was probably World War II. But we didn't have the type of media that we have now, the social media allowing us to actually be connected to everyone. And then, of course, like the ease of travel to actually physically be connected to everyone, actually knowing people personally around the world. So that in one sense is an opportunity. What we do with that opportunity, TBD, who knows, right?
Yeah.
Coming out of this, though, in terms of what will and won't survive, I think we have to operate on the assumption that we're going to be dealing with this for at least another year to 18 months, right?
Yeah.
Depending on how long it takes for a vaccine to be produced, tested, trialed, and then obviously distributed. And if you look at that as a time frame, one thing that is for certain is that, business capitalism won't wait that long, right? Yeah. So what they will do is they will look for solutions to adjust sort of the in-place systems that already exist. So you look at us as a society is really based upon, two main factors, which is like, community, right? And then like commerce. right? And so our economy is structured upon those two things, right? Like we have a lot of different entertainment opportunities or mediums that are based upon bringing people together to make money off of things. So concerts, sporting events, art galleries, exhibitions, festivals, and they're, founded on the notion of tons of people coming together and enjoying something as a collective, right? Of sharing a sort of intimacy. Obviously, the virus directly affects that, right? So the question for those things becomes, well, what are those opportunities and those events become in the face of this, in a world where you have to assume that, okay, well, maybe gatherings are limited by a certain amount of people. Maybe there's some sort of restrictions in terms of spacing, or maybe some of these things move from a physical space to a virtual one altogether, right? There are already things in place where, for instance, like the NBA has been doing like NBA VR for a couple of years now. It's still very early in sort of the deployment of that in sort of a high fidelity way, but the bones are there. One could argue that the only thing that was holding them up from really making that a reality was need. And now here you have a need, right?
Yeah.
You have an environment where.
Let's jump to that. What else do you think? Because you exist in a space, and have existed in a space where we sit in. Oftentimes we sit in these rooms, and there's always this thing that is sold to us that is like, this is going to be the new. This is going to change the way. This is the Facebook of AR. This is the whatever. Like all these products are created for a future that is 10 years away because social adoption is going to take so long in order for people to really buy into it. Piggybacking off of that NBA sort of VR space, do you think anything else is now like, oh yeah, let's dust this off because it just didn't work 2 years ago, but now it's going to be perfect?
I think VR, this is probably the biggest moment for VR in many ways. I really believe that if you're a company that's widely invested in something, right, whether it's sports or concerts or music or film, whatever it may be, whatever medium it is that requires people to actually gather in mass, and all of a sudden that's now threatened. You're looking for solutions, right? And you have a solution here. I think what you see right now happening is sort of a replacement of that, of sort of these grassroots, entrepreneurial efforts by individual personalities, right? Whether it's like Swiss and Timberland with Versus, or like D Nice with his set, or different, artists like Jonathan Mannion doing his talks, right? Like these opportunities and these moments of trying to foster community, and by virtue of community, give people a sense of connectivity and intimacy, because that's ultimately what it comes around, is like shared experience, right?
Yeah.
And those are great things. But they don't really replicate what it's like to actually be in a space with someone, right? It's still very much detached. And what you have holding up VR was really just money, right? Really just major industry saying, let's go ahead and make this, multi-billion-dollar investment to push this through, to provide the sort of, content channel and the technological need support to really bring that in home. I mean, what was it? Earlier last year, I think it was, Facebook launched Oculus Quest, which was sort of the first truly like standalone, high fidelity, like, consumer grade VR product, right? Yeah. So before that, you had to be tethered to a PC, or was something that really wasn't providing you with that much of an enriched experience. It's at the price point of consoles. It's $300, $400, right? And it's kind of set up and ready to be that bridge. So I see that as a potential thing, right? So it's like, we've kind of looked at it from a different perspective, where there's like, you've got, these sort of moments when concerts where they're bringing out the hologram of, artists who've passed. The inverse of that is like, okay, well now you're sort of just buying into, being at this festival, via VR with, your friend set or your group, or you're being, you're at the courtside game virtually, with the same sort of perspective as a courtside seat. So I think that's one of the things that will come. I think certain industries just won't make it, right? So I think movie theaters are gone. If you look at their model, like they're just essentially the publisher, right? They're not to make a drug reference, but they're the guy on the corner, right? But if you got to sort of, direct to supplier relationship, right, then there's no need, right? So it's like if they in fact are the threat, if going to a theater puts you at risk, but you're a major movie host and you're got all these films on backlog and technology allows you to just,
VOD,
stream, why not, right? I think you're going to see a lot of different things sort of change shape in that way. And I think when that starts to occur, when there are these sort of these echelons of varying degrees of, adjustment to our expectations, technology filling in the gaps of some of them, right? But then also just like societal adjustments, like doing away with things, like over time understanding that, hey, look, that existed that way up until this point, and now things are going to be different. I think that's when you'll start to finally get a consumer who is looking for more or looking for different things from brands. But it's going to take time.
Yeah, it's funny because as you were talking about the movie theater thing, while I agree, it definitely could be the nail in the coffin. And it's unfortunate because having lived in LA, there is something still magical about going to the movie theater out there, especially some of the older ones where directors might show up and there's this whole additional experience that'll sort of happen. But I do wonder if the traditional movie theater dies and the age of social distancing, the drive-in comes back. Because if you think about it, it's almost the perfect solution to be able to be socially distanced. You're tuning into a radio signal, so you don't need a microphone or anything. You bring your own stuff and you can kind of set up where you're just far apart, that you can kind of go through the experience and it's still get the benefit of going out and kind of building the communal sort of movie theater thing. But what I was having watched some clips from the Fortnite Travis Scott concert, I almost feel like VR or AR is going to win by not trying to replicate reality. I think that's its biggest issue. I think that there's no way that you're going to be able to make the smell of the shitty bar where you first saw Chance the Rapper play in South Loop or something like that in Chicago. Like, you can't replicate that experience of that sort of place that you go with your friends. But to see Travis Scott 1,000 feet tall in this crazy way in which he can, manipulate and turn into all these things, and then you're in there in this surreal environment, that there could be a way in which that becomes a bit more of a enticement into those sort of things. Like what I've been seeing that's interesting a lot now as the streams have changed is to see now like people using the green screen backgrounds on their on their streams, especially on Twitch, the producers, and so they can throw all kinds of crazy stuff on the background. Same thing with some of the DJ ones that I've seen, and again, kind of like almost the old school retro. It looks like public access, which is hilarious in its own other sort of way. But it's like, oftentimes when we move forward in these leaps, it's also repeating things that have already, existed. And so I do wonder if there's something, we figure out some weird 80s version of the future that we will end up living in for the next couple of years. As we've done it already. I think about it whenever I talk to my niece or talk to my parents on FaceTime, and it's just like, oh yeah, talking on video was literally like the 80s idea. That was like what was supposed to happen, and it just snuck up and no one really noticed it, and now it's the norm, and people will do it in the most obnoxious of ways, especially without headphones or AirPods. but yeah, it's like this thing that we just accept as this norm. And so yeah, I do wonder, there were some people that were talking about like we might end up in a space where we are like Japan for a minute, right? Where DAP is dead, and it's some sort of bowing or some form of a greeting that does not, interact with the other person until you know them, let's say, better. But yeah, I just have this feeling that the customer and the potential consumers almost immediately, at least for the first 6 months to a year, are going to be so cautious with the decisions that they make when it comes to what they purchase, that it's going to cause a forceful shift in, in C-suite conversation, because people are just going to want more. Like, are they going to want 5 different re-releases of Jordans, the same week? Probably not. Like, I don't know if that market makes it out of this era.
I don't know either. I think it comes down to economics, right? It comes down to how hard is the economy hit? Is it hit to that degree where, the futility of that investment becomes a reality and a possibility? And if so, then you find yourself with a consumer who likely is going to demand more out of the products that they buy from a functional standpoint, right? I want to buy, maybe I can only afford to buy 3 pairs of shoes a year now, right? Like, I remember growing up, I got one pair of shoes a year as a kid in our household, right? Like, that was it. That was the standard sort of thing. And so that consideration was a lot different than now, right? It was about, looks, price was another thing, performance was another thing, and in the standpoint of like, can I play sports in this, but it's also going to keep, the snow like out of my shoe in the winter, right? Like, how is this going to clean? Like, what are the materials in this? How do they perform? Like, those are things that I developed as a consideration set around product investments, specifically around shoes, as a child, because my access to them was limited, right? Many millennials arguably haven't had to face that same consideration, right? Like, there's far more options. Like, shoes are far more inexpensive. And I think, if you adjust for inflation than they were when we were growing up. And so, they've been able, and it's been fast fashion, right? So they've been able to just sort of like get this one, get the next one. And like, the big brands are just feeding the machine. They're feeding the addiction. Yeah. If you look at a consumer who's going to have to make those adjustments, I think they will have to start to look at that. And then brands' responsibility is to provide the proper product for them. So, now it's like, there's a lot of brands sort of exploring different materials in the last few years, to address, pollution, or to address
sustainability,
to address, wear and tear. And those are great evolutions. I think now it becomes the point where brands start to look and say, okay, well, what do we offer in the face of a consumer that is, strapped? That can only, invest occasionally. And from a brand standpoint, what is our role and responsibility in that conversation and in that sort of world where, things have decidedly changed? And I hope at least that those are the things that they're trying to think of. My fear is that they're not. My fear is like, it's business as usual. My fear is like, let's lay off some people, let's, delay a few collabs, let's delay a couple releases. And, when we get to go out the house again, let's just kind of like roll out the sort of like inspirational, we're a community, sport lives to us all type of, messaging, and let's just get back to it. Right. And it would be really sad if that's, the sort of, the road that they go down. But I think, again, it's, I think we've divested so much power, right? Like, we as consumers, we've relinquished so much power to brands themselves, right? Like, we were much more critical, I think, back in the day, right? Like, I mean, we're the same age, you and I, essentially. Like, we grew up in the same era where it was like, hype was relished for only the most supreme, undeniable joints, right? It was like, just occasionally the things that would drop would be like, that's the joint to get. This is the one, that was a maybe twice a year thing in footwear, right? Maybe quarterly, right? And then, in apparel too, it was about specific brands, and within those brands, it was about specific silhouettes and specific releases. And there was no big machine leading up to them, outside of like the Nikes of the world, right? It was just like, you had to know where to go. You had to hunt through things. You had to, be connected and be in tune. And to your point, invest the time, right, to really kind of foster those relationships and build that sort of assessment. And I feel like it was a better time. I think it made, designers better. I think it made consumers hungrier. And we were very, I think, we were very real about what we felt about things back then. We were very vocal.
Well, we were forced to be much more connected, right? Because this is an era before fast fashion. This was even the Gap's quality of clothing, was something that you can go and find something at a thrift store right now from the Gap from the 80s or early 90s, and it's just a quality piece that's still there. Good luck looking for something from H&M 6 years ago that's still like together, right? And because we had to search for it, right? If you saw something in a music video that was like, oh shit, the Snow Beach, right? Pullover. There was no immediate, I can just Google and find out what that is. It was, I gotta ask a friend, go to Macy's or go to the Polo Mansion and try to figure out like, where is this thing that I can try to acquire? And in that navigation, you built your friend group around, the people that could help you in that endeavor and realize all the things and interest and all that stuff that they liked and didn't like. And I feel like it definitely made for, it's weird because I would say a more informed consumer, but I think the consumers are definitely more informed now, but I would say that let's be real, it made for a better fan. It made for somebody who stood much more strongly with that idea and had a very specific, had real reasons why they were invested in that thing. Right. And to be fair, I do think that exists now, but I think it's shifted to people because people are still, you can't fast fashion people. You can try, but when you talk to a Kendrick fan or you talk to a J. Cole fan or you talk to even Cardi's biggest fans, the way that they break them down and why they love them as much as they do is the same way that we could talk about Ralph Lauren or talk about, the Jordan 1s versus the 6s versus the 11s. Like there is a shorthand and a focus on what those things represent. I think sometimes, and I see it now when you watch these things on Netflix, I also think that marketing was better at selling us a dream back then because we could only get it from very specific channels. When you watch like The Toys That Made Us or something like that on Netflix, and you're just like, oh man, like these dudes just made this shit up. But like G.I. Joes to me, or, Thundercats meant this entire different world but it was just all consumer bullshit sold to us, through cartoons and toys and different iterations. So maybe it is the lack of information allowed us to be a little bit more mystified and therefore a little bit more invested in, romanticized by those things. Whereas now that doesn't exist anymore, except for a few cases of artists or, products.
Yeah, I think it's the lack of interference, right? The lack of overstimulation, right? Yeah. Like, getting back to sort of the original point, which you brought up, which is like, we were in a period where we could really kind of savor, things had our attention. We were a captive audience. Yeah. And I think because of that, brands, companies, marketers, creatives were much more considered in what they were producing because they knew that it had to kind of hold up to, the assessment of the consumer in like a really attentive way. Yeah. Now it's the flips, or it has been the flip side of that, right? Where it's like, it's the ADD generation. It's like you've got 10 to 15 seconds to like grab someone's attention and really nail why they should be considering this. And if you miss that, then you just miss it. And it is what it is, and in a lot of the research that we do, we walk in really assuming that consumers are far more informed than I think that they are, right? We think that like, oh, they got to know about this, or they got to be on to that, or this, that, and the other. And half the time they're maybe about half as so aware, right? And that's a whole other problem, sort of just like there's so much information, and the way that information now is delivered is so siloed based upon your individual preferences, your age, your background, your economics, your location, the things that you like physically that it just sort of becomes this echo chamber where you're only getting fed the same types of things. So it's like, it's overstimulation. There's far too much to be considered, but most consumers' pipeline of information is also being narrowed by, the apps that we consume through, the channels that we consume through, right? And so all of that, I think, combined with sort of what we were talking about earlier about this, imbalanced commercial model that we've been living in are, sort of some of these ills that I think now we have finally a chance to maybe realize have been affecting us negatively and perhaps, reset.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that I think there are going to be a bunch of stories hopefully rewritten, and I think that people do take the time to be at least aware. You don't have to necessarily do anything immediately, but just be aware of kind of what's happening to maybe make some better informed decisions sort of later on. But I wanted to wrap up with something. A lot of people are looking at this time in terms of reinvention, in terms of like, I hated the job that I was going to every day anyway, and now I'm at home doing it and still hate it. But I also realized that they had me doing, jumping through these hoops in this routine for no reason. Because, and we've discussed this a little bit, so this is a little bit of a question for me, but I'm sure it helps everybody else. If you were thinking about starting your own thing, doing your own thing sort of in this time, do you have any sort of recommendations in how, outside of the easy technical stuff that they can look up, how to create an LLC or a C Corp or S Corp or whatever. But any recommendations in general on how to kind of make that leap from maybe the remote working 9 to 5 and say, fuck going back, I'm going to start my own thing, and, kind of what those ideas or steps might be.
I mean, it's basic, man. I think everybody's journey is their individual path, right? So it's really about just following your heart. I think that's the most important thing. I think we all have different sort of passions. If someone's sitting around and sort of, hating where they are, hating what they're doing with their life, their time, they should invest themselves into like pursuing what they love. I think it's that simple. Obviously, change is always difficult, right? Change can be uncomfortable, but I think at the end of the day, if you're doing what you love, even the hardest days are fulfilling.
Yeah.
Because you're ultimately answering to yourself.
Yeah, no, definitely. Lastly, this podcast was renamed and rebirthed because the more I talk to people, the more industries I bounce in and out of, I realize how impactful hip hop has just been on the world. And so, I want to leave the last question with you. What is something that you learned from hip hop that you use in your everyday life? It could be business, could be, family, it could be anything.
Just keeping it real. That's it. I mean, my personal and professional life in many ways, I think it's been kind of crafted and led by that, for better or for worse, right? Yeah. Like, there's been plenty of environments that I wasn't welcome back to because people didn't like what I had to say. But I think, at the end of the day, right, like, that's the like was just keeping it real. You know, like growing up on the south side of Chicago in the 80s in Bronzeville, you know, I survived by just being true to myself and keeping it real. You know, even today, you know, as I consult and deal with, you know, my clientele and whatnot, it's much the same. I mean, you know, being honest, you know, not being afraid to speak the truth, I think is valued. And I think that we're in a space right now because of, you know, social media and hype and, you know, image pursuits. There's a lack of realness. I think we could deal with a bit more of that. I think the world would be a better place if people kept it real more often.
Well, I hope after this they do, because they understand how much of this shit they thought was real is not. You know. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. Think Like a Rapper, Curtis House.
Brother, thanks for having me.
No problem.